Hi,
Hi, Dr. Julie.
how are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing great, thank you. So, would you like to start with your chapter, or would you like me to start with the other chapter?
I can start.
Okay, great. Do you know how to share your screen?
Oh, wait, hold on. Let me pull up the PPT.
Okay.
Sorry, it's going here slowly.
That's okay. Take your time.
Okay, here we go. Let's see. Okay, let me see how to share.
There we go. I can see it.
Oh, okay, perfect. Okay, should I just start talking?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, and I apologize. I'm at a cafe, so I'm sorry about the music in the
No
background.
worries. That's fine.
Okay, so this is chapter 16, Controversy and Change in How We View L2 Writing in International Context by Christine Pearson Cass.
Are you speaking, or you put yourself back on mute?
Oh, sorry. I have been talking this whole time. Sorry.
I heard the first slide and then you disappeared.
Okay. So this is Christine Pearson Casnave. She received her PhD from Stanford. She works at Temple University in Japan, where she advises doctoral students about qualitative dissertations. And her publications focus on qualitative inquiry into graduate and professional academic literacy practices, second language writing, and writing for publication. So in this chapter, she talks about the 5 controversial perspectives. And the 5 perspectives are the generic academic essay, contrastive rhetoric, process writing, error correction, and writing as an assessment tool. So why are these controversial? Casnave says these perspectives pay little attention to the situated and local nature of writing. She says all of these are that all writing is located in some kind of local discourse community and emerges in relation to this environment. She talks a lot about the, what did she say, ecological nature
Right.
of writing. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That it doesn't make sense to look at L2 English writing practices through the monolingual native speaker lens. And that's what we've been hearing a lot in our reading about English as an international language.
Right.
And all of these perspectives are too ethnocentric, too monolingual, too disassociated from the local multilingual communities and contexts that are most of the world's English learners situated in. So the generic academic essay, this is the standard 5-paragraph essay that has a thesis, positions, evidence, conclusion, and then we cite our sources. And Casnave asserts that this is not useful outside of English class or outside of a writing class. She says that writing conventions are locally and contextually dependent on their use within different discourse and disciplinary communities. And Research shows that writing actually improves through practice and immersion in community-situated literacy activities rather than through instruction and rather than instruction in or correction of the generic academic essay. And it's not clear if features or strategies for writing this essay transfer to different kinds of writing. And she questions if this writing, if we can learn anything from this writing outside of just foundational knowledge of grammar and vocabulary. And is it very useful? Because other than like high stakes essay exams like TOEIC or TOEFL, this writing isn't very useful. And she questions, why do we continue to teach this unless students need it for specific purposes like high stakes testing? And maybe writing is best taught in situ as practice with particular discourse communities. Dr. Julie, I'd like to talk about this a little bit. The first point, this of particular discourse communities. What does she exactly mean?
What she means is different groups inside the society. So you might have one discourse community, you'll be involved in several. So you might have one of your students at your school, and another one would be the group of faculty members at your school. And each of those you would have different types of discourse that you would use with them. You would have different language, different ways of structuring your sentences, different topics that you would tend to talk about, different tone. And with a group of administrators, it would still be yet a different discourse community. And then outside of school, you have your...
Okay, I got you, cool. Number 2, contrastive rhetoric. And this is how a person's first language and culture influence writing in a second language. So the standard American English writing is that we write linear, logical, straightforward type writing. And that supposedly in other cultures they write different ways, and that's why our students don't write in the standard American way. But this movement is accused of presenting rhetorical structures as static rather than dynamic. It's been accused of ethnocentrism, of comparing apples and oranges, and of neglecting the hybrid and social political natures of text and text production.
What did you think of those criticisms? Did you agree with them?
You know, I'm not sure, because this is something I've always believed as well. Because when I first heard about it, I'm like, oh, that's why they can't write it that way. But then when Casnave says that it's actually, that's more, many novice L1 writers don't write this way either, that they don't get that way until they practice and write more, then that made sense. But so I don't know. Yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, I was also a little bit surprised. I understand the criticism of them being ethnocentric because they're just saying that the two cultures are kind of static and this is the way it is when you compare them. And so they didn't look at all of the different nuances. And of course, you have different levels and different discourse communities and so many variables. So I understand that, but I agree with you that I think that I was really surprised by them criticizing the process approach to teaching writing, that with revising and giving feedback to students wasn't necessarily helpful, because then I question, well, what is the teacher to do then? Just provide them with samples to read and they would pick up the grammar from that or whatever corrections. That I find surprising.
Yeah, I was surprised with that as well. With the I'll talk about it when I get to that slide. But yeah, I was also surprised.
Yeah.
Okay, so because of this mix of culture, thought patterns, and writing, contrastive rhetoric has outlived its usefulness. An EIL perspective seeks out evidence of diversity as well as stability of writing conventions and styles in particular contexts, rather than presuming that languages and cultures have unique rhetorical patterns. See, I struggle with that sentence. I feel like they do have their own unique rhetorical patterns.
I have to agree with you. That's certainly been my experience. And it's not only the rhetorical pattern, but the cultural patterns and the patterns of thought and logic and polite discourse all seem to follow those similar patterns. I mean, I just find English a much more direct culture in general. It's okay to come up to somebody and just ask what you need rather than needing to beat around the bush and make friends and ask about the family, etc. Hi, Karen. So I really do think that there are different patterns, and that's really been my experience. So
Yeah, mine too. Like when I lived and worked in Korea teaching English for 8 years, and I found there's definitely a cultural difference. There's a certain way to say and do things, and I don't think that that's crazy to assume that transfers into their writing as well.
right. Yeah. So if you see their writing patterns, they have their own conventions, right? And you even talked at the beginning how the 5-part essay is kind of silly because we don't really use that in any other context. So I guess one way of looking at the criticism is that we would have different types of discourse or different rhetoric, types of rhetoric depending on the discourse genre. So it's not just one type. I guess perhaps that's more of the criticism than that they don't exist at all.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so an EIL perspective does not presume that oversimplified American English-based rhetorical structures and standard grammar should be taught throughout the world. Number 3, process writing. So this is based on the differences between how experts write and how novice writers write. And experts find that experts tend to write more recursively, plan more, had more well-organized knowledge, and were not distracted by mechanical details like grammar. And they wait until late in the process to fix that, and they reread and revise often. Novice writers did not have well-organized knowledge, planned little, did not reread, and worried about small details and revised little. So this led to practices to try and get novice writers to do what the experts do. We ask novice writers to worry about final product, and we tell them to worry about grammar until later, not during the drafting, but until what's the stage? Revision or
Right. Yeah. Redrafting, rewriting.
Yeah, and brainstorm before writing, write freely, review what they write multiple drafts. But later evidence shows from Reed in 1984 that experts don't all necessarily write this way. Some brainstorm first, some outline first. And we also learned that topic knowledge, individual diversity, and local and situational constraints on writing tasks are essential aspects of how we understand what it means to learn to write.
And what did you think of that? What is your writing process? Do you follow what we teach, and do you brainstorm or outline and then do a rough draft and revisions? And do you not worry about grammar in the beginning and just free write, or is your strategy very different?
When I first started writing, this was before computers were like huge. So my writing was always by hand on paper. And I would, what I do now is totally different. Now I write down some like bullet points, sort of an outline, and then I type everything on the computer, but I'm constantly revising as I'm writing. I go back and revise whole paragraphs, or I move paragraphs around. And the computer has totally changed how I write.
Right. That's a really good point, how artifacts and tools can also influence discourse communities and rhetoric patterns. So certainly when you were working at handwriting or typing something and you'd have to retype it to move things around, it completely changed the thought process.
Yeah, I think from the steps of writing, the brainstorming, drafting, revising, and all that, I think I switch between all of the stages constantly.
that's an interesting point. So that's, you're making the point that it is a cyclical process, which is what they're trying to teach in the process approach. So it's not linear sequential that you necessarily follow those steps. You could easily do some brainstorming in the middle of writing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And Karen, if you have anything to say, please jump in. So the implications for the L2 classroom practice. So the problem, these steps in writing, the way that Flower and Hayes presented, is not the way they intended. So the way we do it is a stage-oriented model of writing where students do all of these steps together as a class. So Dr. Julie, I'm guessing it doesn't say explicitly in the text, so I guess that's not how it was supposed to be done?
Right. It doesn't explicitly state what they did intend. What I assume from the reading is that they didn't intend for it to be done as a group with everybody following the same step.
Okay. Yeah, okay.
Every person might have their own process or steps, and those were just examples.
Okay, cool. Also, as mentioned in the previous slide, not all experts write this way. Even the author, Casanave, writes, "My own writing strategies do not fit the general description of the expert writer that emerged from the process writing era either." In the EIL process writing classroom, students would become acquainted with the many steps involved in writing and then work on their own to choose what to write and to discover how they best write with guidance from teachers and classmates using L1 as needed. This is number 4, error correction in writing instruction. So the goal of correction is to help students reach a target language standard, where target language tends to be the language of a native speaker from an inner circle country like the US, Australia, New Zealand. Students expect, so why do we do error correction? Students expect it and they want it, so teachers provide it. Otherwise, students may lose motivation to write, and as we know, motivation along with continued practice is essential to improvement. And evidence shows that correction does help if it's done systematically, selectively, and consistently. But then we enter John Truscott in 1996, who claims there's little evidence that grammar correction helps students improve their writing. He correctly points out that it makes no sense to say that correction improves writing if all we are looking at is a revised draft of the same piece of writing. Truscott says improvement in writing comes in developmental stages, through practice, through reading, and through exposure to models.
I would have to argue that revising a draft and incorporating the corrections is a type of practice.
I agree. Yeah, I agree. I think I didn't value it as much as I did until I started graduate school, but every chance I get to revise and fix an assignment, I learn more from it every time.
Right, I think so too.
So implications for classroom practice. The goal of error correction is to help students reach this target language, but from an EIL perspective, one need not strive for this native speaker competency. For English as an international language, emphasis is placed on communication and meaning making and not perfect grammar. From an EIL perspective, the only writing that needs to be polished according to standards of perfection in English dominant context is writing that has high stakes consequences, like a job application, an essay for an English language company, an article for publication in an international journal, a business letter to an important English speaking client. And number 5, writing as an assessment tool. So writing is used worldwide as an assessment tool, and I found particularly interesting it's used in countries where there's no tradition of dedicated writing instruction. From a global perspective, Reichelt found that writing instruction in many parts of the world focuses on building language proficiency, has instrumental purposes for work for use in international education, as well as exam-related purposes. High-stakes essay exams cannot be avoided, things like TESOL or TOEIC. They're used for entrance to schools, used for graduations, and for promotions. This form and style of essay exam is not found anywhere other than in these circumstances.
Yeah, I have this experience in Saudi Arabia. We have a lot of difficulty. We run a program there, and it's just really not a writing culture. It was an oral tradition until, I don't know, maybe 80 years ago or so. So it's rather new in their history. Doesn't mean that the youngsters today don't write, but they don't emphasize it. They don't have a very strong tradition like they would in England, for example, where you have history of playwrights and authors. It's just quite a different mentality.
Oh, that's interesting. So implications for L2 classroom practice. Essay exams require students to use generic Western influence structure and style and to write on topics that may not be relevant to them. An English as an international language approach will encourage writing teachers to help students with whatever writing they must do within the purposes of their local contexts. An EIL approach may also work at resisting the increasing influence of the standardized essay exam, which serves purposes that have little to do with writing. So in conclusion, the author Casanave asserts that we look at writing from an ecological, which I think she means contextual framework,
Yes.
to help us understand why these perspectives do not suit an EIL approach to English language education. Writing instruction in an ecological and EIL perspective needs to be experiential, contextualized, activity-based, and developmental. We do not need to abandon anything in our teaching of writing that serves a purpose and that is understood in ecological or contextual ways. This purpose might include instruction in Western influenced essay exams, if this is what students need to do to get into a graduate school of their choice. But as the EIL perspective argues, this kind of Western writing is only part of the story. We need to look beyond these stereotypes to deeper complexities within their own contexts.
Great. So what are your takeaways from this chapter? What might you include in your teaching or discard?
For all of these, I think I just took the writing class with Dr. I don't remember who, but maybe just I feel it was just a couple quarters ago, and all of these that Casanave talks about, all of these controversial things, just I don't know, because they're all that I know. It feels so strange to have them questioned, which is actually something she brings up in the beginning of the chapter, how teachers we do, this is what we know, this is what we teach, and so we feel like this is what's right, and this is the way it's supposed to be. So it really makes me question everything. I think maybe the one on error correction made me question the most. I feel like if we don't correct our students, I definitely understand not overcorrecting, because that's demotivating, definitely. But as it said, research shows if we do it consistently, systematically, in this certain way, it does help. So I don't know, a lot of these I just really struggle with accepting.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's kind of surprising. So I thought it was interesting too, where you mentioned that the author said that teachers provide correction because that's what the students expect. But why is it that that's what they expect? Is that because that's what society expects from teacher-student interaction? Like, where does that demand come from? I don't think it originates from the student initially. I think that it has a longer history than that.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hi, yeah.
Hi. I'd like to just add on that about the correction, that maybe students don't demand it as much as it comes from society. I think there are these perceptions of the role of a teacher, and I sometimes, well, well, I'm teaching elementary school kids, and a few of my students are more advanced. They have more advanced skills already. And some of them sometimes write a journal in English. And I'm so impressed that they're trying to do that. And they bring it to me and they want me to check it. And I just want to write good job, you know, that and not correct their errors. But the mom usually wants me to correct their errors. And then if I mark it up, and I hand it back to the student with all this red, I feel so guilty, like it's taking away from that good job, you know. But if I don't correct it, then it comes back to me like, oh, you didn't catch this mistake, you know. It's like they're checking my checking or something. It's kind of bizarre, but, I don't know. The other thing, when I do something with my fourth graders, and it's sort of a simple exercise that we're doing while sort of as busy work while we're taking them out to do individual testing. But with the writing, we're having them try to copy something that's a paragraph that's in the textbook, so that they get familiar with spacing in the English language, and that the first letter should always be capitalized, and we should have a period, and just copying is a big challenge for them. So it's when I look at those and I'm correcting their mistakes, then they feel, when I give the paper back to the students, they feel they have to fix their mistake. But I see them, and I think they're not even thinking about their mistake. They're just like sort of mechanically going through, oh, this was wrong, so here it is, now I've corrected it, without really thinking what was wrong about it. There's that about, just underline, there's a mistake in this area, but figure out what it is. My students aren't at that stage yet where they can figure out what the mistake is, but there's so many things behind that red pen correcting.
Yeah, I think you brought up two really good points. One is, if the teacher doesn't mark it up, where's the evidence that the teacher read the piece of writing? That's how we know how careful they were, right? Is how much red they put. They really took their time. If you just write good job at the top, it seems like they're just rubber stamping them and pushing them through and not giving them any attention.
Yes, exactly.
And the other point that you brought up about the using the cues for students to figure out where the mistake is, I totally agree with you. I think that if you correct it for them and then they just mechanically do it, they're not consciously thinking about the error and trying to learn. They're just doing it because that's a required step. I don't think they have the right attitude in general, but I do like the method of using symbols where you can put, it can be a little bit more specific than drawing a line in a section, but like putting WW for wrong word, or VT for verb tense, or ART for article, or something like that. So, or P for punctuation. So they at least have to think of what the response was. Problematically, I've had a lot of students that'll just throw anything in. Like, I still think that they don't really take the time to ponder the mistake and try and correct it and learn from it. I think they just throw anything in. So maybe we as teachers need to educate students about the importance of the revision process and how it can be helpful, as opposed to being just for getting a better grade.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's possible to go back. I missed the first part, but there was something, I looked through Shannon's PowerPoint yesterday, and in this chapter, it kind of made me think about my own literacy or lack of my writing skills in Japanese, which is kind of, it just has become my second language, I guess, after living here so long. But the whole thing about that contrastive rhetoric, I can really see the author's point that if we as English teachers and native speakers of English critically sort of hack at their writing in English without knowing their cultural background and what is their traditional writing style. It from a native speaker of English standpoint, I think we're sort of minimizing, marginalizing their effort, and a lot of times I'll hear English teachers speaking, and it sounds like, oh, they don't do that in their own language. So like as if they don't have that skill. It's challenging their level of intelligence. And I have that same conflict or controversy. I have those feelings about writing in Japanese, that I have started to become aware of how Japanese is written, should be written, but I have trouble writing it that way. And I feel that my coworkers perhaps judge my intelligence level based on my lack of ability to do that in Japanese, when I am fully capable of doing that in my own language.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, when I was reading that, I could relate to how even high level, like, some non-native speakers of English are trying to, join these classes, these graduate classes. I'm just so impressed by their efforts, because it's a whole nother world, the way we write in English. But on the other hand, as English teachers, I think we need to present, oh, this is how we write a business letter. This is how we write, this is what appropriate writing for email in the business world would be. Because in English as an international language, they're likely to encounter that aspect, and they're going to need that skill.
Absolutely. Yeah, so the question is then, which Western paradigms must you teach, and which ones should you try to contextualize? It's a complex question.
Yeah, well, when my son was taking, my son is bilingual, but he was studying at university here in Japan, and he had to take all these English classes, and he was placed in the advanced level English classes. And he had a lot of writing to do. So I was sometimes helping him with that. And I would look at the textbooks. They were originally designed textbooks by the professors at that university, specifically for students of engineering, science and engineering. But when I was looking at that, traditional, this is how you write an essay. And yeah, it was frustrating going through all that. But I was talking with my son about this a couple days ago after reading this chapter, and he said he appreciates that he had to go through that, because it was a whole, like, he now looks back and he sees how he was able to grow through that process. So, it wasn't a lot of fun when he was doing it, but as far as becoming more aware of how English is written, he thought it was valuable.
Why was it frustrating?
Why was it frustrating? Because it was so boxy. It was so like, it has to be this way. This is how we do it in English. And I had frustration with that too, because I was like, oh, there needs to be a little bit more flexibility here.
That's so funny. I guess it depends on the learner's level. I mean, he was in an advanced class, but I can see how that much scaffolding is super helpful for beginner and low intermediates, but definitely you need to have some dotted lines as opposed to boxes when you get to the more advanced levels.
Yeah.
Great points. All right, well, let's look at the chapter about reading then, and we can kind of draw our conclusions about both of them. I kind of enjoyed these two chapters. I thought that they were a bit less political and a little bit more interesting in terms of pushing the envelope in terms of what techniques we should use in the classroom. I really think it's kind of shaking it up a bit in terms of like the chapter that Shaw just presented, talking about should we even provide error correction or not, and if it's useful. And the research is showing that it's not. So it's such a fundamental teaching skill that we use that it's so odd to question that which we have always used. So I'm certainly open-minded, but it seems like they left more of a vacuum than a solution in terms of what we should do now if process writing isn't the key. I guess they're kind of just making the case throughout the book that everything needs to be somewhat contextualized and individualized, and you have to take the language community into consideration, that we can't have these one-size-fits-all solutions, which make life easier in general, but they might fail to address the needs of certain students in certain situations, kind of like the example that you just gave, Karen. So Catherine Wallace is the author of this chapter, and she's a professor in the UK. And she's been working at colleges in London for over 40 years. So she has lots of experience. I thought this was nice to see the different books that she's written. So you can see a bit of her background in reading and bilingual literacy. So the chapter talks about critical reading. And so they talk about two different points of view of critical reading. And they talked about discourse analysis, and which is from Fairclough, that we've discussed in like the first or second class of the quarter. And critical reading always takes the context into consideration. So you need to look at who wrote the text, who they wrote it for, what was their purpose, what was their intention, where was it published? Was it published in a right-wing newspaper or a left-wing newspaper, or a supposedly neutral paper, or a maybe like a local community newspaper, or an internet source versus a print source. All of these locations for publication have a strong stance that they take, and as a critical reader, you need to be aware of not only what the publisher and the genre dictate, but also the individual differences of the author, as well as the topic and the timing of it too. If you're looking at a newspaper article, for example, are you talking about it at the very beginning of the incident, or is it an incident that's been going on for a long time, and readers should be well aware of all of the characters in the situation? So there's a lot of variables to take into consideration. One of the most important ones, I think, is who funded the research, which is actually quite difficult to find. So it's very hard for us to know. So there's been so much published, like just for example, if you take climate change, there are two camps, as you well know, those that are believers and those that are deniers. And there are two bodies of research that have been published, one completely showing the validity of the concept of global warming, or at least of climate change. And the other camp has their own whole tomes written on how it's complete nonsense and not true. And science is not be all end all, and we tend to give it that type of credibility. We tend to give it that stance that it's men in white coats in a laboratory, or just as we treat doctors, that they have power in the discourse. So we tend to believe them without stopping to question the analysis of the data. How was the data collected? What were the questions in the questionnaire that was used to collect the data? And one of the interesting things that you find with research is that there usually is some kind of a bias on the part of the author, because they go into researching that topic in the first place because it's something that they're interested in. So there's an inherent internal, intrinsic desire to prove themselves right. It's very hard for a scientist to truly maintain a completely objective stance and just let the data reveal itself. And even if you look at experiments in quantum physics, we have what we call the observer effect. And if you're measuring even photons, photons move differently if they're being observed or not. So imagine the difference in how people behave if they're being observed or not. We adjust our behavior according to who's observing us and what we assume that they want to see. So everything needs to be read with a very critical perspective, actually. Nothing is surface level exactly the way it has been presented to us. There are so many different motives and biases, and some of them could very well be unconscious. I'm not accusing all scientists or authors of having a secret agenda, but certainly they have their own motivations and interests and desires for doing that type of research, and the need to publish and the need to receive funding for large-scale experiments. And in the chapter that Shaw presented, she talked about the standardized exams like TOEIC and TOEFL. And with time, we have found those to be very culturally biased. There are certain questions that people who are outside of even the US, not necessarily just the inner circle countries, but as you may know, TOEFL is a US based standardized exam, and IELTS is the Commonwealth version of the same thing. They're both high stakes tests that allow students to enter the university or not. And because they were written by people in either the United States or England, at least initially. I mean, eventually on the teams, they've probably hired more international collaborators, but we certainly found that the initial tests were quite biased according to where they were produced, because the writer is just writing from their own perspective. We can't blame them, really. I mean, how could they possibly write from an African perspective, for example? They wouldn't even know how to do so. So they might have the best of intentions of trying to be generic and non-culturally biased, but just by being part of that culture, it transmits through their writing. The same thing was found with intelligence tests. So in the past, the measure of intelligence, the IQ test, was developed by Stanford Binet in the 1950s, I think. It might have been earlier than that, but it's quite an old exam. And it was thought to measure intelligence, and intelligence was thought to be a static measure. So if you measured somebody's intelligence, it would generally stay about the same, because it's not a measure of knowledge, it's a measure of cognitive ability. So cognitive ability is somewhat genetic and somewhat based on environment, but all things being equal, they didn't assume that intelligence changed much throughout one's life, despite the fact that you may have studied or not. But later in the 80s, maybe sooner, we started to discover that this intelligence exam was highly culturally biased, and that African American students in the US would typically perform very poorly on this exam. And in the beginning times, it was just assumed that they were less intelligent or were being exposed to much poorer environments where they didn't have the same types of enrichment activities that upper class white children had the advantage of. And so that was why the results were generally lower in suburban populations tend to score higher, and inner city populations tend to score lower. And, so it's not a question of where the people live as much as who is living in those neighborhoods, and the socioeconomic status of the people in those neighborhoods. And then, so there were questions that Black children couldn't answer. They would ask questions about things like, I don't know, peanut butter and jelly sandwich or something that wasn't like a typical afternoon snack. So something as basic as that could cause a problem in the child's comprehension of the test item. And then Goldman came along with the theory of multiple intelligences. And that really shaped our concept of intelligence with the typical IQ measurement. And what he proposed, which I'm sure that you're all familiar with, is that we don't have just one measure of intelligence, but we have many ways of being smart. So we have a logical intelligence, we have an artistic intelligence, we have a musical intelligence, we have spatial intelligence. So like, for example, people who are interior designers have a very good spatial intelligence. They're able to imagine in their head, if you were to reorganize the furniture and the color in the room, you would have a different look with the lighting and the windows, etc. And other people don't have that talent for being able to visualize like that. So I think that there are 7 different intelligences. He had a couple others on to it later. I think like naturalistic intelligence was one that he added later. So people who are smart about plants and animals and surviving in nature and being able to know which way is west and to navigate by the stars and to find food and water if you're stranded in the mountains. So the concept of intelligence then changed to be something that was more contextualized and more based on the individual talents and the environment that that individual was exposed to. So she has a little video here about the top 7 English-speaking countries with some stats, and I won't play that for you right now. You can watch that later, but it was kind of interesting because like Germany, for example, was number 7, and something like 55% of the population in Germany speaks English. So it's a really high number. So it's not one of the countries that comes to your mind right away when you think of English-speaking countries. So talking a little bit about like skills and strategies and how to work with reading with students. So in this case, at least with the reading, they're still continuing to promote reading strategies as being important, and talked about some of the gist and main idea. And so they didn't really shake our concept of how to teach reading as much as they did our concept of how to teach writing, in terms of what is our tried and true and what we know and are comfortable using. And it was interesting that they pointed out that sometimes students learn to read before they actually learn to speak. So that's probably people who are more introverted, or perhaps adults who are studying on their own, who are studying maybe like using a language as a library language just for research initially, and then later learning to use it to speak. or people who might be using English in some ESP situations. So if you have like English for engineers, they're usually taught reading well before speaking because that's a skill that they need immediately, and they don't necessarily need to know how to speak in the language. So obviously reading and writing are cultural and social activities, and they're embedded in our everyday activities. And Shaw brought up a good example when she was talking about writing, about how the advent of the computer changed her process with writing, because you can move text around and change the order of paragraphs and revise as you write. And so this is a cultural artifact or tool that is available in advanced societies, advanced technologically, but that might not be available in countries where they have energy shortages or lack of access to the internet. So there are ways that people don't have access to all of the same tools depending on where they live. Then the author talked about social practice and social roles in terms of reading. So you can talk about roles as a code breaker. And I really do think of reading as a code breaking activity. And I think maybe Karen, you can talk a little bit about this, because I know that you work with young learners, but when you're teaching them phonemic awareness, and when they're able to then decipher the code and put syllables and sounds together in order to understand words. But I think that certainly the same process happens with adults. And when you get into very dense, difficult texts, we're really code breakers, because you have to read and reread and analyze and try and understand what they were referring to. And in my experience, I think one of the most difficult skills is being able to understand the referent. So if we're talking about words like demonstrative pronouns or pronouns in general, sometimes it's very difficult to know what the reader was referring to. What is this? Is this right here, or is this in front? And so some languages have that code where you use one word for something that was referred to in an antecedent, and you use a different word for something that comes later in the text. But novice writers don't always necessarily dominate that skill and know how to do it. So we are certainly participants in reading. Reading might be considered a receptive skill when we think of listening and reading as receptive, and speaking and writing as productive skills, but the receptive skills are certainly not passive. The listener, the reader, has to be an active participant, or they won't pay attention, they won't understand. And I'm sure you've had the experience where when you're reading and you just read a whole page and you can't remember what you just read because your mind was somewhere else. So this code breaking requires a lot of cognitive attention and focus and interest and alertness too, because we all know it's very difficult to do when you're super tired. So then talking about thinking of the text as a user or as an analyst. There are different ways of looking at the roles and resources. One other thing that we need to look at is the genre, of course. So is the text supposed to be written, or is it supposed to be given as a speech? Is it supposed to be oral? It was written down. Maybe it's a transcription. So just because something is written doesn't mean that it's not produced for oral consumption. And so this has obvious implications for the structure of the text, the words that are chosen, the length of the sentence, the type of sentences that are used. That's all tied to the context, and it's specific to the genre. So reading is certainly a sociocultural and interpretive process. It includes so many different variables such as identity, disposition, and stance. So basically these three words kind of indicate what the reader's attitude is towards the topic, towards the place where the piece of writing was published, towards the speaker or the author. There are a lot of variables that will influence the reader's disposition and their stance or their attitude. And their identity is usually a more solid construct that certainly influences their point of view. So you might even just notice, for example, like if you're watching the news, and there's a channel that you like let's say, for example, you're a CNN person and you go to somebody's house and they've got Fox News on. Your reaction, your stance to it is going to be totally different because you'll have an identity as being a liberal, and they're watching a conservative channel, so it will affect your disposition towards the text. You would tend to be more critical and more disbelieving of somebody from the opposite camp or the opposite party. So those are certainly important topics for us to educate our students about, and it's something that they probably aren't aware of in their own language and their reading in their own L1. And so this is all part of the teaching students to be lifelong learners and to be critical thinkers, that you always have to stop and question whatever it is that you're reading or listening to or being told. And it's a healthy thing. It's not a rude thing. It's not, so critical doesn't necessarily mean to criticize. It just means to question, which is the important thing. Let me just read down here. It's kind of, yeah.
Came to mind in the talk about identity, disposition, and stance. I'm thinking about, well, the word that came to mind is comfort. The comfort level. You know, when you're looking at English as a foreign language, or for me, Japanese as a foreign language, there's that other, you know, that it's, when you first look at it, it's so overwhelming, so daunting that sometimes, you know, especially if a book is, there is only text on the page, there aren't any pictures, and you think, how am I going to get through this? But when you actually start to look at it, focus on it, concentrate, maybe you can get through it. But I can really understand, I guess this is part of the empathy, you know, I can understand how my students are feeling when they're looking at the first English that they're reading. You know, we've tried to ease them into it to become comfortable with looking at the letters and the words and then the sentences, and, you know, maybe in a storybook that there's just one sentence per page, you know, the easier levels. And but that's kind of a little bit different than looking at it critically and being able to analyze who it was written for and all that. But just as approaching reading, just wanted to add that.
Yeah, super good point, definitely. So this is certainly more of a higher order thinking skill that you would work more with more advanced students. You could start certainly at even at the beginning levels by just real basic questions about the format and the structure, or what kind of text it is, looking at genres and things like that. But that's a good point, because with the beginners, there's a lot to attend to, and it's asking a lot to have them attend to that as well. So the other perspective that they talked about was Paulo Freire, and we've talked about him before and how he worked with the pedagogy of the oppressed. And so he was a Brazilian educator in the 1930s. So he was working in rural Brazil in the 1930s. So you can just imagine like how isolated that was, because I travel in Brazil quite a bit, and there are still regions in 2019 where they're quite rural and they have a lack of water, and nowadays you can pretty much get internet everywhere, but still the level of public education, for example, is quite low, and the literacy levels are quite low. So if you can imagine, in the 1930s, he was working with rural farm workers who generally had very little elementary level education. They might have gotten to the 3rd or 5th grade or something, and they needed to stop studying in order to help the family on the farm. And it just wasn't tradition in that society, or a requirement that they finish high school. It wasn't seen as a top priority. But what he did was to focus on those people's dignity, as opposed to treating them as being ignorant because they didn't have opportunity. He chose to emphasize what they did know and the perspective that they brought to the classroom, and really honoring them. So this chapter talks a little bit about the politically and socially charged words that you might work with in a Freirean perspective. So you have to think of words like illiterate, for example. That's a hugely charged word because it has implications of somebody being less than, or ignorant, or slow, stupid. I mean, you might have a compassionate perspective, but in general, it has some pretty negative implications. So you need to think of how these words have a political and social encoding to them. And the other perspective is the critical discourse analysis perspective, which I talked about previously. So critical discourse analysis is a really interesting study. I really enjoy it a lot. And basically what they do is they look at a text on 3 different levels. So on the first level, they look at the text itself. So looking at things like the structure of the text, the genre, whether it was oral or written, is it an advertisement? What type of text is it? And then the second level is looking at like a interpersonal level. So it's looking at who is the reader, who was the writer, where was it published. So it's starting to get some more social variables in it. And then at the third level is looking at it from a societal perspective. So you kind of zoom out and then look at it from a macro perspective. So you look at that piece of discourse in relation to other similar pieces of discourse, or that piece of discourse in relation to other genres, or which discourse community did it take place in? Was it in rural Brazil, or was it a scientist in Norway, or what was the overarching social influence? Well, it's a very interesting way to analyze text. And the author cites Halliday and talks about the parameters that he uses for the analysis of written and spoken text. And she's got a really nice slide here that explains that. So if you talk about the 3 main ways of looking at the text, according to Halliday, is the field, the tenor, and the mode. So the field is looking at the content, at the text itself and the structure of it. And the mode is more the how. Will it be written or oral? Will it be spontaneous, or will it be planned? And how will it be published? And the tenor, what do you think of when you think of tenor? Tenor is kind of like the voice. So it's like, what's the relationship between the author and the audience? Is the author coming at it from a superior point of view, where he's the keeper of all knowledge and so therefore must speak with expertise and authority? Or perhaps he's a novice asking for help and advice. It could be the opposite, or you could be equals. Is it a personal or interpersonal relationship? Is it formal or informal? And which voice will be used? Will it be first person? Is it okay to use the personal pronoun I or we, or is that prohibited in that genre? and what type of language will be used. Should you use a formal register, or can you use idiomatic expressions, slang, bad words? Could you use code switching, depending on who the audience is, perhaps? So we talked a little bit about this, that like with beginner learners, of course, you need to encourage them a bit more. And we don't want to necessarily get into so much of the critical part, because they need the basic skills to be able to do the reading. So we want to try and encourage a positive disposition and a positive stance, that they're willing to learn, and they're willing to look up words in the dictionary, and they're willing to feel uncomfortable because they don't know everything, and that's okay. And they're at least becoming aware of their stance in relation to the text. Whereas with more advanced readers, then we can work with our pre, while, and post model. So Shaw talked about that a little bit when she talked about the writing process, and we talked about pre, while, and post writing tasks. So if you think of pre-writing tasks as brainstorming and outlining or doing mind maps, and the while is writing the first draft and doing the revisions, and then the post might be rereading what you had read and incorporating corrections received from another person. So if we apply that to reading, we usually think of the pre-stage with reading as activating the student's schema. So that's getting them to talk about the topic, so that they're already thinking about vocabulary that they use in relation to that situation, or the context, or the typical people or genre that we'll be working with. They might already be thinking about vocab and grammar structures. And the while for reading then would be many different strategies that we can give for students to focus on. And we talked before this class about using skimming, scanning, reading for gist, finding the main idea, looking at the structure, finding the thesis statement, looking for specific grammar structures or vocabulary items, underlining, doing all kinds of different note-taking while doing the reading, circling words that you don't know, using contextual guessing. These are all while strategies. And then for post-reading strategies, what would you suggest? Do you know any post-reading strategies?
Something simple, like maybe giving a summation of what they read, or doing some sort of productive activity, like if they read about a problem, maybe they have to come up with some solutions.
Perfect. Can you add a couple more, Karen?
Well, it depends on the level of the students, but if they are able to reflect on what they just read and try to perhaps give their own opinion, that's a very high level skill, but something that they could use in looking back at something they just read.
Absolutely, great. So what you mentioned is like kind of starting to get them into the critical perspective. So we have post tasks that might just focus on the skill itself. It's just the ones that Shaw mentioned, like having them write a response to it, or to talk to their partner about what they understood, or like incorporating a different skill. But we can certainly now start to think about incorporating some critical pedagogies at the post-reading level. They can be done at the pre-reading level too. So you might ask them, who is this author, like we did in these multimodal presentations, looking them up, seeing who they are, where was it published, what kind of work do they do. So you can do it in the pre-stage too.
Excuse me, I would also just like to interject. For the beginner learners, I think that to some degree we can do some of the pre and while and post reading you know, in activating their schema, trying to get them to think about it before, even with stories, or recall to make it relevant to why we're reading it now. And while reading, my coworkers and I were doing a lot of scaffolding to support their, I guess in a sense, uptake of the language, not just enjoying the story. Post, we maybe don't do as much when it's with the little kids, but I think for noticing, you know, trying to get them to help their awareness.
Yeah, noticing is a very important topic, because we know that that's very important for language learners, that language learners don't learn that which they don't notice. It sounds obvious, but if you imagine if you're a beginner level learner, obviously there's a lot of input that you hear, but you don't necessarily notice it because it could just be almost meaningless sound to you. Like, for example, if I'm traveling in Egypt and listening to the television in Arabic, I might pick up a couple of words, and those are the words that I notice because those are the words I know, but I don't know the language, and so most of it goes unnoticed. So noticing is a very important skill to teach, to work with, because you want to know where you want to draw your students' attention. What structures and vocab do you want them to notice, or pronunciation, or whatever it is that you're focusing on? And only then does it become intake. So there's input, and we don't necessarily attend to everything. What we do attend to can become intake and therefore cause learning. So that's a great point. Well, great. So I'm kind of happy with these two chapters. I feel like they're getting a little bit less political and a little bit more focused on the skills, which is a little more practical. I kind of appreciate that. Like, okay, finding good, I understand. We have to make it individualized, and you know that it's not fair to use a inner circle perspective all the time, and we need to be a little bit more sympathetic to the people who are actually learning English around the world, and that it's not just held by the inner circle anymore. But I like these chapters where it gets a little bit more into the practicality of, okay, finding good, now how do we apply that in the classroom? So do you have any questions about any upcoming assignments? How are you doing with your keywords, with your research? I looked at Karen's annotated bib just before class because she had a question about it, but I haven't seen yours yet, Shaw.
No questions. I'm okay.
Okay, great. And you're good with your keywords now? And Karen, you're doing okay too? You all right?
Well, yesterday I was watching the Zoom meeting from last week, and you were already starting to talk about the map, the keyword map, which is going to be due this coming Sunday.
Right.
And I started creating just an outline, not putting any words in it yet, but already sort of trying to get the graphic in my head.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know. I've only read two articles so far, so I want to try to get into more of the articles and see how I can pull it together, like what common thread I can find in order to write the literature review, because I think it was written somewhere, or you mentioned also in the Zoom meeting, that we have to think of that this might be, even if we're not going to be doing research after, like what would we want to be finding? Why are we reading this, and what do we want to show the person that's going to read our literature review? So I'm just trying to wrap my head around all that, and I think I just need to get through reading more of the articles so I can to try to piece that together. I kind of think I have to drop one of my keywords if that's possible, because I think I need, if I have, the way I have it right now, I don't really see how I can pull it together. Like when I started researching about the inquiry-based learning, and I was just finding all these things about science classes.
Right.
It was interesting, and some of them were related to English language learners, science classes for ELLs specifically, but
Mm.
it was just kind of going in a totally different direction. So
So that's interesting because Shaw had the same kind of problem at the very beginning where she was just getting, her keywords are working with color blindness in the classroom. And so initially she was just getting hits for articles that were for about general education, not about TESOL. She couldn't find anything with TESOL. And then we changed her search so that she was searching with, initially she had been searching only in ERIC. So when you do your searches, Karen, be sure you don't limit it just to ERIC because the database can also search EBSCOhost. And I think that a lot of the language journals are not necessarily in ERIC. I think more of the science journals go to ERIC. So just make sure you've done that when you do your search because you might get some more relevant articles. And then the other thing too is that I know that you're at the very beginning stages of this right now because you've only submitted 2 articles for the annotated bib. So there's no way that you can have an overall perspective yet of what you want to write about. But this is to start to jog your mind and get you thinking to go down that path. And so one of the things that you might want to do is just to skim through a lot of the abstracts in the journals that are getting generated by your search. So those may or may not be articles that you choose to work with in your lit review, but just by skimming through the abstracts, you'll get a better global perspective of your topic, of your keywords, and that might help you to focus a little bit for your keyword map.
okay, thank you.
Sure. All right, ladies. Well, thank you so much for joining, and it's a pleasure to chat with you, and I look forward to talking with you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Yeah, I'm
Dr.
glad I could join today. It's probably the only time this quarter that I'm not working, but it's a holiday here in Japan. So
Oh, I'm so glad you were able to make it. What time is it there?
it's just after 11 in the morning, 11:20 now.
Perfect. Yeah, so it's usually during your work day.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you were able to make it live to at least one session.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.